In October 2008, we dedicated the George and Barbara Bush Center and Legacy Library on our campus, and our formal collaboration with the George Herbert Walker Bush Presidential Library and the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M began last year at this event. Lieutenant General Brent Scowcroft shared fascinating insights and personal stories about the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall when he was part of President Bush's administration. It was a compelling keynote address. We are looking forward to building more important academic opportunities for our students and faculty at UNE and Texas A&M. Today we welcome Andrew Card, who has served 3 U.S. presidents and is currently the Dean of the Bush School of Government and Public Service. The bond of President and Mrs. Bush with Maine and with UNE is strengthened by Dean Card's lecture here today and our continued academic linkage with Texas A&M. In his inaugural address in 1989, President Bush said, "I see history as a book with many pages. Each day we fill a page with acts of hopefulness and meaning. The book of the Bush's lives are filled with many days such as this." In the years since President Bush shared those words, the world has changed. The Cold War ended. General Scowcroft discussed this so eloquently with us last year. We have economic crises, we have earthquakes, we have had tsunamis, we've had 9/11. These pages of history have challenged all of us, but we are a strong nation and we remain hopeful. Even in the midst of these challenges every day, we continue to see on our campus and in our communities the 1,000 points of light that President Bush has called on us to light. Dean Card will touch on many things today, but he will also talk about this changed world. In the decades since that iconic picture of Andrew Card leaning over to tell President Bush about the second plane hitting the Twin Towers, in that period of time we've seen and our nation has been changed. Whispered Interruption is the title of his talk today, and I really am looking forward to the insights that he'll share. I invite you all to visit the special exhibit, A Legacy of a President, that's on display in the UNE Bush Legacy Library. This includes some wonderful photos of President and Mrs. Bush over the last 20 years. We really are grateful to the Presidential Library and their museum for sharing these with us. Finally, I want to add my thanks to Peter and Rosalind Whalen, whose generous grant to the university makes the lecture series possible. And thank you all for being with us, and now let's enjoy the lecture.
Good evening. My name is Ali Amida, and I'm the chair of the Department of Political Science at UNE, and I would like to welcome Dean Card to our university and our community in Southern Maine, and also thank you for coming tonight. We have a wonderful full house for such a distinguished lecture. What I would like to do is very briefly to say a few words and a few points about our speaker's short biography. Dean Card has a very, very impressive career, public service, and now is embarking in academic career in Texas. He attended the University of South Carolina and the United States Merchant Marine Academy, and then the John Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. After that, he served in the state of Massachusetts as a legislator, and he was named the Legislator of the Year and received the Distinguished Legislator Award. After that, Mr. Card continued a very, very impressive career serving our national government. He held variety of top-level governmental positions under the U.S. presidents, ranging from President Ronald Reagan to later on to become the White House Chief of Staff under President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2006. Also, he served as Deputy Chief of Staff and subsequently the Secretary of Transportation under President George H.W. Bush, and continued to serve variety of, in this high-level capacity, our federal government. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Dean Card, and it's my pleasure to ask him to join us, and let's all give him a very nice applause for visiting our UNE and giving his lecture on the topic of the whispering interruption. Bush heads a changed world, and without any further ado, I ask Dean Card to come to the podium and give us his lecture.
Well, thank you very much. I was overwhelmed when I got the invitation to be here. The two people that I respect the most in my life as an American citizen are two phenomenal citizens of the world. In fact, I think they personify what true citizenship means, and that would be President Bush and Barbara Bush. So. It's also great to be in a community where I can say my name as I learned it, Card. I now live in Texas, and I have to say card. And I find that very hard. There are others in the audience that trigger an awful lot of memories. Nancy Bush Ellis was really the Bush that I knew best first, because she is the one that helped to motivate me to be involved, to help her brother become first vice president and then president of the United States, and it's great to see Nan here. Thank you. You know, September is a truly amazing month for our country. There have been more historical happenings in the month of September than any other month of the year for the United States of America. In fact, there wouldn't be a United States of America if it weren't for September. And I bet most of you didn't pay much attention to celebrate that reality. But it was on September 17th when we celebrated our Constitution. And I know lots of people who celebrate the Declaration of Independence. I haven't found anybody celebrating the Articles of Confederation, but it's really the US Constitution that gave us our country. And said it was our country. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, do hereby ordain. And that Constitution is a phenomenal document. In fact, it is a document that is not perfect. Perfectionists were arguing for a lot more. But a controversial committee of style got together and presented a document of compromise that gave us a country. And that document is phenomenal because it is only an invitation unless you accept the invitation. It's our country, but there is no obligation to participate in it unless you accept the invitation. And the invitation is so phenomenal, and yet so few people accept it. In fact, the invitation was so great that some states said they didn't want to ratify the Constitution unless there were some amendments provided. And the promise of those amendments are what gave us the Constitution. And those amendments, for most people in America and around the world, actually define the Constitution. And you know the amendments, those first 10 amendments. And that First Amendment is pretty phenomenal because it says we can actually practice our faith without the government telling us how to. We can exercise our speech without the government limiting it. We can gather with people who share our views, even if they don't like us. We can gather with them. We have the right to petition our government to address our grievances. There's also an institutional promise that the press will be able to write about the government in ways that the government doesn't like. And I find that that First Amendment is how most people describe our Constitution. That's what they think America is all about. But I can tell you, I have a different view. I love the First Amendment. I do. I love it. And I speak and I gather. I'm not the least bit afraid to petition. I actually practice my faith. But I love the Constitution for a different reason. Because it gave us a form of government that truly is unique among the world governments, even today. If you go and talk about government in Europe, you find that most people think government is about a parliament and a prime minister. That would be one and the same. Our government is divided. Article 1, Congress, the House and the Senate. Article 3, wise people wearing robes and most people don't know their names. And they have a tendency to look back at what you did and see if it was consistent with what our founding fathers suggested we should do. But then there's something called Article 2. And Article 2 is remarkable. First of all, it's a relatively short article in that Constitution. But it gives responsibilities to one person. So it's the only provision of our Constitution that is personified by one person, the President of the United States. I talked about the Constitution being an invitation. I've accepted the invitation. I had a grandmother that wouldn't let me ignore it. She was a suffragette. She said, "It's your government, get involved." So it didn't take much for me to understand the invitation to serve on the planning board in Holbrook, Massachusetts, or to run for the legislature. Didn't take much for me to expect to have an invitation to participate in a campaign. Even though I was an engineer, and engineers aren't supposed to be participating in campaigns. The invitation was real. My grandmother made sure I understood it. And so I've had some pretty phenomenal invitations. But the greatest invitation that I ever received was an invitation to serve Article 2 in the Constitution. And there are lots of reasons why that invitation shouldn't have come. I happen to believe the invitation to serve as Chief of Staff to Article 2 in the Constitution probably came because of two people that I respect the most. Maybe they whispered something in the president's ear. I hope it didn't turn out to be a crisis. But the invitation to serve the President of the United States was an invitation I never expected to have. And even when it was given, I thought it was an invitation to do another job. and the president-elect had to kind of hit me off the side of the head and say, I'm not talking about that one. But when I accepted the invitation, my expectations were very, very different than the reality of the responsibility. Now, I had been blessed to work at the White House for other presidents. President Ronald Reagan, President George Herbert Walker Bush. I served under every chief of staff that served those presidents. And you know them, the Troika, Baker, Mies Deaver, and Jim Baker, Don Regan, Howard Baker, Ken Duberstein, John Sununu, right next door, Sam Skinner, Jim Baker again. And it was great to serve in the White House under those chiefs of staff. But boy, was it different to actually be the chief of staff. And when I became the chief of staff and received that spectacular honor to be able to raise my right hand and take an oath, it called for me to do what a lot of people are called to do when they raise their right hand and take an oath: to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. What a privilege. But my expectations were to be just the opposite of the television show Cheers. You know Cheers. That's the bar in Boston where everybody knows your name. I wanted to be the chief of staff where nobody knew his name. I wanted to keep those trains running on time. I wanted the president to be well served. I didn't want it to be about the chief of staff. I wanted it to be about those spectacular experts that the president hires to make a difference in policy. The Dr. Condoleezza Rices, the Colin Powells. That's what I wanted it to be about. But then there was this spectacular day in America. In fact, it was like a perfect day everywhere in the lower 48. And the president woke up in Sarasota, Florida, at a resort. It was a Republican-type resort, tennis and golf. And the president was anxious to go on the golf course, but he wasn't going to play golf. He was actually going to go for a run. And you know the Bushes are all extremely competitive. I have never seen a Bush allow a grandchild to beat them at anything. And President George W. Bush was excited that morning because he had invited a reporter to run with him. And it wasn't just going to be a jog, it was going to be a run. And he'd been training, and the reporter that he invited to run with him was a very good runner. In fact, he'd been an NCAA All-American cross-country runner. And the president woke up a little nervous that morning. And when he out to the course to run, I was a little worried because there was a terrible stench in the air. The night before, we noticed that it did stink, and people in Maine may understand this. The red tide had killed some fish. They washed up on the beach, and it stunk. And I was worried that the president was going to go for a very aggressive run on the golf course and that he might get sick. So I actually tracked down one of the president's physicians, and I said, if the president goes out for a tough run this morning, is he going to get sick? And the physician looked at me like I was an idiot and said, no. And then I walked into the president's room, and he's putting on his running clothes and getting ready to go out the door. And I said, when you get back, we'll do the CIA briefing, and we'll get ready to go over to that school. It should be an easy day. And by the way, Mr. President, you'll be all right on your run today. You won't get sick because of the stench. And he looks at me like, right. He comes back from the run. He's feeling really good. Ran one of his best times, beat this NCAA All-American, and he was kind of strutting. And I've watched the president strut. It's not a pretty sight sometimes. And then we sat down and we had our CIA briefing, and nothing was really memorable about it. And then we piled into limousines and we head over to the Emma E. Booker School in Sarasota. It's an elementary school. And on the way over, there was a buzz in the air. It kind of, anybody hear about a plane crash in New York? And I remember Karl Rove kind of asking a specific question, and Dan Bartlett asking us a specific question. And we got to the school, and President Bush went right to the phone and called the National Security Advisor, Dr. Condoleezza Rice. I didn't hear that conversation. I poked my head into a classroom that was being filled with students, and press pool was starting to gather at the back. I actually noticed something wrong. There was a misspelled word on one of the bulletin boards. Very astutely, someone took a book cover and covered that word. Didn't want a potato problem. Then the president came and stood beside the door to the classroom, and he was standing with the principal. And that's when the director of the White House Situation Room walked up to the president and said, "Sir, it appears a small twin-engine prop plane crashed into one of the towers at the World Trade Center in New York City." And our collective response was, "Oh, what a horrible accident. The pilot must have had a heart attack or something." And then the principal opened the door to the classroom. And the president walked in. The door shut. And that same staffer, the director of the White House Situation Room, came up to me and said, "Sir, it appears it's not a small twin-engine prop plane. It was a commercial jetliner." And my mind flashed to the fear that must have been experienced by the passengers on that plane. They had to know it wasn't gaining altitude. But that thought didn't last very long, because a nanosecond later, that same staffer came to me and said, "Oh my gosh, another plane hit the other tower at the World Trade Center." I stood at the door of that classroom, and I did think about UBL. Osama bin Laden, that's what we called them. But I also performed a test. And it's a test that chiefs of staff have to perform all the time. And the truth is, it's not a very easy test. It was easy on this day. Does the president need to know? Yes. I made a decision that I would pass on 2 facts and make 1 editorial comment, and that I would do nothing to invite a question. I didn't want to start a dialogue. I thought about the words that I would say. I wanted them to be efficient. I think if I'd been smart enough, I would have said, I want it to be tweetable. I opened the door to the classroom, and the teacher was speaking to the president and kind of to the students at the same time, kind of a dialogue between the president and the students. I was struck by how young and innocent those second graders were. I was also struck by how mature and cynical the press corps was. 2 very different audiences. And Ann Compton from ABC News spotted me, and it was unusual for me to enter the room after the president had gone in. And she said, "Stop." And I said, and she said, and then there was a break in the conversation in the front of the classroom, and I walked up to the president, and I leaned over, and I whispered into his right ear, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." And that's all I said to him. And I stood back from him, and I worked my way back to the door of the classroom. And I saw that the president didn't get up. I spotted the Secretary of Education, Rod Page, and Sandy Kress, a White House staffer on education, and the principal of the school in my left peripheral vision. In my right peripheral vision, I saw Ari Fleischer, the press secretary, talking to reporters. I opened the door to the holding room and walked in. I was really pleased that the president stayed in the classroom. He did nothing to invite fear on those very young children. He did nothing to demonstrate fear to the media that would have translated it to the satisfaction of the terrorists all around the world. I was also pleased that he stayed there because he gave me an opportunity to get some work done so that he could have what he needed to do his job. I remember telling the staff, get the FBI director on the phone. Get a line open to the vice president. Get a line open to the Situation Room back at the White House. Get the crew back on Air Force One. They hadn't planned to take off for several more hours. To the Secret Service, I said, get the motorcade and turn it around. To Dan Bartlett and the communications team, I said, we need some remarks written for the president because we've got 600 people in a gymnasium right next door. And then the president walked into the holding room. And as is typical, everybody kind of got up and went right to the president. What was the first thing he said? Get the FBI director on the phone. And we could say, right here, Mr. President. I was very impressed with how he reacted that day. You know the rest of that day. My fear is that you'll pay more about what I'm saying about the day than you will about what you really should remember that day. That was a day that innocence was violated. That was a day that innocent people were killed. That was a day when first responders answered the call to duty and became victims themselves. That was a day when some phenomenal heroes answered a call not from the draft board, not from a general, not as a result of an oath, but they said, let's roll. And that was the first counterattack in the war on terror. And if they'd been wearing uniforms, I would have been among the first to nominate them to be Medal of Honor winners, because I'm convinced they saved lots of lives. So that's what I want you to remember, even though I'm telling you the story of my role that day. Don't forget the victims. Don't forget the families of the victims. And don't forget the heroes. The president went to Barksdale Air Force Base. By the way, the conversations on Air Force One were phenomenal. I watched a president recognize all of his duties. He was very worried that the Russians might overreact, and he called President Putin and said, don't think this is rude to have a nuclear attack. Don't attack us. We're not attacking you. Yes, we learned about the attack on the Pentagon, and he was trying to reach Secretary Rumsfeld and was frustrated that he couldn't find him. He was out helping the victims. Yes, he called back to the White House. Yes, he had to make some very, 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 very tough decisions. Mr. President, do you authorize our fighter jets to shoot down American commercial jetliners that don't heed the call from the FAA? And I'll never forget him looking at me right after he authorized that action. And he said, I was an Air National Guard pilot. I can't imagine getting that order, but I gave it. He was very anxious to get back to Washington, D.C. In fact, he promised the audience at the Emma E. Booker School that he was going right back to Washington, D.C. And when we got on Air Force One, and by the way, Air Force One took off at a very steep incline and flew up at 45,000 feet, which is pretty high. And we flew like this, serpentine, waiting for fighter jets to catch up with us, to offer protection. And we went to Barksdale Air Force Base and trimmed down the staff, and the president recorded a message for the American people. Then we flew to Strategic Air Command in Omaha, Nebraska, into a very deep bunker, right out of the movies, flat screen TVs all around, all these admirals and generals. And by the way, admirals and generals don't know how to react in front of the commander-in-chief. They don't know whether they're supposed to stand or sit, so they're kind of... And the president said, they've got work to do and I'm preventing them from doing their work, let's go to another room. And we did. And he had a National Security Council meeting by secure video. And then the president finally got his demand. And believe it or not, I think I was in the way of his demand being requested for a long time that day. He wanted to go back to Washington, and the Secret Service was telling me, no way, no how, until we know more about the nature of the attacks. And the Air Force was also a little reluctant to go back to Washington until they knew whether or not Air Force One would be secure landing at Andrews Air Force Base. But neither of those entities had the courage of their conviction to stand in front of the president and tell him that. I did. And he yelled at me many, many times. And I tried to be very cool, calm, and collected. Mr. President, I cannot recommend that. But after we went to the Strategic Air Command, we winged our way to Washington, D.C., and that was when we saw on television the two towers come crashing down. In the images of people jumping from the World Trade Centers, in the image of those buildings pancaking down, they define that day. We landed at Andrews Air Force Base, and by the way, when we were coming in to land, we were struck by how we could see the faces of the pilots in the jets that were accompanying Air Force One to protect the president. We could also see smoke billowing from the Pentagon. We piled into a helicopter and we lifted off, and normally helicopters kind of fly right straight to the White House. Not this time. The helicopter flew very low to the ground, treetop level, weaving back and forth, making it harder for any Stinger missile-toting terrorist to find the Marine One. And we're looking out the window of the helicopter and the smoke coming out of the Pentagon, and the president says to me, "That's the face of war in the 21st century." We landed at the South Lawn, and the president went right into the Oval Office. It was being set up for a televised address. Klieg lights were being rolled in, cameras were being rolled in, the rug was rolled up. And the president went to the dining room just off of the Oval Office and started working on a speech. And then he came out and he addressed all of us. It was an address that really did change the world because it included some diplomatic instructions for the State Department. And it included a message to leaders all around the world. And it was basically, you're either with us or against us. And I know for a fact that General Musharraf in Pakistan was squirming in his seat. Please don't make me decide. Colonel Gaddafi, crazy Colonel Gaddafi, he's the first one to say, I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you, I am with you. Silence from North Korea. Silence from Iran. And a comment from Iraq. We're interested in providing $2,000 rewards for the families of any suicide bombers. That night after the address, the president went to a National Security Council meeting down in the bunker underneath the White House. Something, by the way, that we never talked about until 9/11. But it's real. I went back to my office and was sitting at my desk when 2 Secret Service agents barged into my office and literally lifted me out of my chair and kind of made me run down the corridors. And we went to the bunker underneath the White House. Down comes the First Lady. She didn't have her contacts on. She was wearing a robe and silly slippers and carrying a pet. Then the president came down wearing a robe, carrying a pet, and wearing silly slippers. And they went into a bedroom that is in the bunker for the president and the First Lady with a nice bed. I had a steel cot. But none of us had to spend the night there because the Secret Service came down moments later and said, it's all clear. A plane had entered the airspace. Mr. President, you can go back up to the residence. I went back to my office. My heart is pounding, the adrenaline is running, and I had not talked to my wife the entire day. And when I got home, it was very late, and I talked too much. That was the day when the fog of war made it very difficult to understand the nature of what had really happened. But it was a day that did change the world. Do you remember how we changed that day? We all gave up labels that divide us and embraced labels that unite us. We all found a way to find an American flag and wear it, put it in our front yard. We were resolved. We were also paranoid. Was there another attack coming? They got on the plane in Portland. Who else is in Portland? We were skeptical of our neighbors, but we loved them, and we were united, but we changed that day. We cried that day. We were aghast that day. We were sad that day. The world changed too, because they realized that organization and structure in government and the rule of law was under attack. So virtually every nation in the world that cared about organization, structure, and the rule of law said, we're standing with you. We changed. We also knew that our government would change. So I wake up the next morning hoping that the fog of war is lifted so that we can fully understand what happened and what would be coming next. But we were too raw. We were worried about the victims that were still being found, praying that they would be found alive. The recovery was real. The search was consuming. The missing found pleas for them. We took photographs and posted them all over the place. Look for my daughter, look for my son. We had new friends. Hundreds of thousands of Americans made best friends with Canadians because planes had landed in Canada that were supposed to be coming to the United States. And then the next day came, and government started to find its stride and started to talk about what needed to be done, not just the need to make sure nothing else happened. And then we came to my most memorable day at the White House. And that's a hyperbole. That is a hyperbole, because any day at the White House is really memorable. And when people say they want to leave the White House, they're lying. No one wants to leave the White House. If they leave the White House, they either forced to or they needed to. But nobody wanted to. But September 14th, 2001 was the day that trumped every other day for me. If you want to be a chief of staff to the President of the United States who is disciplined and gets to work on time, you have to get to work earlier than on time. I get to work at 5:30 a.m. And when I would arrive at work, I had some really exciting things to do. Like, one of the most coolest things in the whole wide world is to read a document called the PDB, the President's Daily Brief. And it's like the top secret document that, the truth is, there's more myth to its value than there is reality, but it is really cool to say you're on the list to be able to read it. And I was really cool because I was on the list to be able to read it. And I showed up at my desk, and I can't wait to read the PDB that morning. And I look at it, and it was almost unreadable. Not because of the print, but because of how large it was. It looked like the New York phone book. I was used to seeing PDBs that were 5, 10, 15, 20 pages at the most. And this was a thick document, and that was the day that the CIA became the CYA. Because I think they put every threat to the president in that report with no analysis. And my rule was, if it's on my desk, I've got to read it. And I'm plowing through it, and I'm plowing through it. And then this box starts flashing on my desk, and it is a really cool box. It was put there by the Secret Service, and it let me know where the president always was, and the First Lady, and the Vice President, and the Second Lady, and Dr. Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor. And it also told me where Jenna and Barbara were. Very cool, and I never told their parents. The box is flashing this morning, and it's flashing much earlier than usual. It was 6:45 a.m. I hadn't finished all of my readings. I ran down to the Oval Office, and I exercised a phenomenal privilege. What a phenomenal privilege. Because I said, "Good morning, Mr. President," every day he came to work. What a great privilege. And I would always follow up, say, "Mr. President, let me tell you what today is going to be like." And I started to tell him about his day. And he interrupted me. He says, "Andy, I'll tell you what my day is going to be like." That's not very comforting if you're in charge of his day. And he said, "I want you to bring the FBI director over here for a briefing." And I'm thinking to myself, oof, that's a rare request. That request hasn't been honored since Watergate. Because FBI directors didn't come to the White House that much after Watergate, because no one wanted the perception that the president was trying to manipulate politically what the FBI was doing. But I said to the president, "Yes, sir," and I went right out and I called the FBI director, Bob Mueller. He'd only been on the job for 10 days. I said, "Come to the White House, bring a briefer, and I'll be calling the Attorney General as well." I called the Attorney General. I told the Attorney General he was welcome, and I said, "Come at 8:20. We'll do it right after the CIA briefing." I stuck my head back into the Oval Office and said to the President, the FBI Director, a briefer, and the Attorney General would be here at 8:20. We do the CIA briefing first and then bring them in, and he said, fine. I then went to the senior staff meeting in the Roosevelt Room, about 20 people, senior staff. I typically would get up and leave that meeting at 2 minutes of 8 and walk into the Oval Office and sit with the president when he had his CIA briefing. And I'd be there with the vice president, the national security advisor, and it was always really interesting. In fact, I think it was one of the most important meetings that the president had every day. At 8:20, I got up and checked on the FBI director and the attorney general. They were there, and I stuck my head back into the Oval Office, told the president they were there, and he said, bring them in. They came in. We all moved around on the couches in front of the fireplace. The briefer took the position right next to the president. The FBI director sat in a chair at the end of the couch. The attorney general sat in another chair. The briefer turns to the president, and the president says, welcome, and tell me what you're going to tell me. And he starts going on with a very interesting briefing. It was all about what happened and the investigation that they were doing and what they think they were learning. And I remember being really interested in what was being said, but then the president said, I'm really interested in that. But actually of greater concern to me is, what are you doing to prevent the next attack? And the briefer looks down the couch to the chair, to the FBI director. The FBI director looks over to the attorney general looks over to the briefer looks back to the FBI director, and the FBI director says to the president, Mr. President, we'll have to get back to you on that one. Now that sounds bad. It was not. When the meeting broke up, everybody's leaving the Oval Office, and I'm standing beside the grandfather's clock. And as the FBI director walks by me, he turns to the briefer and says, as soon as we get back to the Bureau, we're changing the mission of the FBI. And they changed the mission of the FBI. The top mission, prevent the next attack. I'm still standing beside that grandfather's clock, and the president comes over to me. And he says, Andy, I want to convene the War Council at Camp David tomorrow morning. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no such thing as the War Council. But I knew exactly what he meant. And I said, yes, sir, we'll try to do it 10 o'clock at Camp David tomorrow morning. And I went down and got my assistant and gave her the list of people I thought she should call to invite to the meeting at Camp David. Then I went down to the Oval Office, and the president is meeting with the head of Cabinet Affairs. And there's kind of a stack of cue cards and instructions for the president for the cabinet meeting. And the president is looking through the cards, and then the president gets up from his desk, and we walk into the cabinet room, and everybody stands. The president takes his seat, and everybody sits. And then we begin with a prayer, which is how every cabinet meeting I have ever attended always began, with a prayer. And then the president looks up and turns to the Secretary of State for a report, then turns to the Secretary of Defense for a report. The cue cards called for him to call on the Secretary of the Treasury for a report, but he turns the cue cards over, and he looks up at the cabinet, and he says, we are at war. But while we're at war, we have a job to do, and it's a job of governing. And with phenomenal specificity, he addressed every member of the cabinet about their jobs, including the drug czar, the trade rep, and the OMB director. And it was a tour de force. Then the press came in, took a couple little quick pictures, and then we left the meeting. We all piled into limousines, and we all went to the same place. It was a mammoth building in Washington, D.C. on a hill called the National Cathedral. Our former presidents were there. Representatives of almost every clergy in America were there. There were senators and congressmen and governors and ambassadors and generals and admirals and doctors and nurses. The Reverend Billy Graham gave a sermon. We said prayers. We sang hymns. the President addressed us. And he reminded us of a higher power and a greater good. And he prayed for a nation, and he prayed for the world. And we sang a hymn, and we left. We went out to Andrews Air Force Base, and there was this beautiful 747 with the words United States of America on it. And the President climbed the stairs to that 747, and it became Air Force One. And we lifted off, and we flew to McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. And when we got off the plane, we were met by the governor of New York and the mayor of New York City. And the President went on a helicopter, and it became Marine One. And we lifted off. And we flew along the coast of New Jersey, and then all of a sudden you saw her, the Statue of Liberty. And she was beautiful. The sun was glistening off of her torch, but the sky was eerie because there were no planes in it. Nothing taking off from JFK or LaGuardia, nothing taking off from Liberty Airport in Newark. And then we reached the tip of Manhattan. And there's a pillar of black smoke coming out of a giant hole. And we circle around that pillar of smoke, and we're all looking out the windows, and no one's saying a word. And you saw thousands of people around the edge of that hole. And they were construction workers. They were rescue workers. They were the people looking for survivors. The helicopter landed at Wall Street. We piled into Suburbans and started driving through the streets of New York. And I've been to New York many times with presidents, and there's all kinds of reactions. There are people that are kind of, who cares? There are people that are angry because you've disrupted the traffic flow. There are people who are thrilled. There were some single-digit hellos along the way. This was very different. As we're approaching the World Trade Center, there are police lines set up. And the people behind the police lines are all wearing hard hats. And the President says to the Secret Service, "Stop, I want to get out." The Secret Service wasn't happy. Nobody had gone through a magnetometer. They didn't have their Social Security numbers run through the computer system. But the President got out. And there were lots of reactions. As the President's working his way down the police barricade, someone starts chanting, "USA, USA," and then everyone is chanting USA, USA. And I look over and there are people hanging off of scaffolding, USA, USA. And they have Japanese flags on their uniforms. And a team of search and rescue dogs. And the handlers of those dogs are chanting USA, USA, and they had Canadian flags on their uniforms. And the President reached a crushed vehicle. It turns out it's a crushed fire engine. And we had put a firefighter up there, Bob Beckwith. And Carl Rove and Nina Bishop, an advanced woman, had tracked down a bullhorn. And I said to the President, "Would you be interested in making any comments to the crowd?" And he said to me, "Do you think it's appropriate?" And I said, "Yes." And he climbed up on that crushed fire engine after a Secret Service agent had climbed up and kind of gone. And then someone yelled out in the crowd, "I can't hear you." And the President said, "I can hear you. And the whole world will hear us." And then with more chants of USA, USA, the President gets into the Suburban, and we drive to the Jacob Javits Center, which is a mammoth building We drive inside the building, and there are all of these booths set up. You know, the pipe and the blue drape. And in the booths are rescue workers. And they came from every state in the Union and 38 countries around the world. And the President went to every single unit and thanked them for being there, took pictures with them, rallied them. And then he piled into the limousine, and he thinks we're leaving the Jacob Javits building, but we weren't. We turned left and went to another part of the Jacob Javits building, and the limousine stopped, and Secret Service opened the door to the car, and the President gets out, and an advance man is there to say, Mr. President, we've got a room set up here, and there's a microphone and a small stage at the front of the room. The thought is that you'd stay 15 minutes, offer some remarks. And the President said, well, who's in the room? He said, it's some of the families of the policemen and firemen that are missing down at Ground Zero. And the President says, I am not going to the microphone. And he just walks in the room. People didn't expect him to walk into the room. Nobody was standing. Nobody was lining up to shake his hand. Instead, he went to them. And there was tremendous hope. Oh, was there hope? My husband will be found. My son's a professional. He'll find his way out. My daughter will be okay. There was tremendous fear. There was anger. There were a lot of tears. There were a lot of prayers. There was some laughter. Lots of hugs. The President went to every single person in that room. As he's getting ready to leave, there's a woman who's sitting against a column. And her family is gathered around her, and she was one of the first people the President saw when he walked into the room. And she stands up in her chair and takes a step toward the President, and she holds out her hand and looks the President right in the eyes and said, Mr. President, I want you to have this. This is my son's badge. His name is George Howard. Don't ever forget him. And she drops the badge in the President's hand. Everybody's crying. The President has tears streaming down his cheeks. I'm bawling. And the President looks at Mrs. Howard and he says, America will forget. We'll start to move on. That's our nature. But you don't have to worry about me. I will never forget. And he took the badge and he put it in his pocket. And we walked out of the room, tears coming down. We got in the back of the limousine and we drove over to the landing zone. The President gets out, takes his picture with the firefighters and the policemen in the air protecting the helicopter. The staff crushes onto Marine One, and the President gets in and takes his seat, and we lift off. And no one says a word. No one says a word. We land at McGuire Air Force Base. The staff runs and gets on that 747. The President goes to a very small jet. And as soon as the President got on it, it became Air Force One. The stairs are pulled up, the door is shut. It's a pilot and a co-pilot, a communications officer, a doctor, a military aide, a couple Secret Service agents, and me. The plane starts to get on the runway, and I'm sitting at a table right opposite the President, and he is slouched in his chair. And I'm convinced he's physically exhausted, mentally exhausted, emotionally exhausted, And I believe he's spiritually exhausted. And I looked up at him and I said, Mr. President, you're a great president. And he looks up at me like, what? I said, you did everything that a president could be expected to do. And you did it in one day. And his eyes get big. I said, you gave a new mission to a federal bureaucracy, the FBI. As Commander-in-Chief, you called for the convening of the War Council. As the head of government, you reminded us that while we were at war, we had a job of governing to do. You told the world they would hear us. You prayed for a nation, reminded us of a higher calling. You rallied the rescue workers, and you comforted the victims. And he looked up at me, and all he said was, thank you. We landed at Hagerstown, Maryland, right near Camp David. It was a day that changed me. The President of the United States takes a responsibility that comes from that Constitution that is almost beyond comprehension. Because they put their hand on a Bible, raise a hand, and take an oath that is the shortest oath taken by anyone who serves in government. It's an oath that has no conditional clause to it. There is no if. The oath says, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. It doesn't say if it's easy. It doesn't say if the wind is blowing in the right direction. It doesn't say if it's going to be understood. It doesn't say if the UN gives you permission. It doesn't even say if the French are on board. It is an obligation that is phenomenally challenging because it is lonely and it is final. I respect that Constitution. Because of the Constitution, I know that it's my Constitution too. But the greatest respect I have for any individual is the one who takes that oath, especially the presidents that I served, most notably the one in this room. When he had to make a decision that called for him to make our country safer, it was very different than what his son had to do. It centered around a battle that most people weren't paying attention to. It was a battle in Panama. A battle of corruption and greed and drug cartels. A battle where Americans were taken hostage, and some were held against their will. And the president had to make a decision. And I'll never forget when he made the decision, the empathy that I saw in him defined the job of being president. Because I heard him say, not to me, probably to a higher power. But he said, I'm making a decision that will cost young men their lives. So the burdens of the presidency are phenomenal. And our world changed on that day, 9/11. But there's one thing I'm really glad about. Our Constitution didn't change on 9/11. And the resolve that Article 2 has to keep our Constitution is real. With that, I say thank you, God bless you, and I'd be glad to take any questions. I have become very, very good at overstaying my welcome. After all, I did it as Chief of Staff. I would be more than pleased to take some questions, but I'll try to be efficient, and with the questions, try to be efficient too, and I'll try to answer them.
Yeah, just a few. The way we'd like to organize the questions and comments, there are 2 microphones here on the floor, and we'll try to be egalitarian and give equal weight to each section of our audience tonight. So let's start, John. You could line up if you would like, or you could just stand and John will give you the microphone. And I would like you to be kind and identify yourself before you ask your question. That would be very kind.
Well, as you are contemplating whether or not you have the courage to ask me a question, the title of my talk I decided to write as a tweet. So, whispered information. President Bush leads a changed world. I actually had an idea that I should deliver my whole address with sentences that had no more than 40 characters in them. But I found it too difficult, and I'm not that digitally engaged with the world. But anyway, does anybody have a question? Yes.
Thank you for that very moving and really inspiring talk. I'm Beth DeWolf. I'm the chair of the history department. And as a historian and as an American, I have in my head these cultural photographs of American history, moments that define us as a people. Martin Luther King's speech, the Kennedy assassination, the Challenger, and happier events as well. But what I'm curious about for you is that iconic image of you whispering to the president is one of those cultural photographs that will endure for generations. What is it like for you personally to know that you are going to be the representative visually of this tremendous moment in American history?
The truth is I'm a little bit embarrassed. And I'm going to say this in the context of the decision that the president had to face. It is so rare that a message like I had to deliver to the president is delivered. There aren't that many times that a message like that is delivered to a president or a prime minister or a king or a queen or whatever. So that's pretty rare in and of itself. Think how rare it is that the message is delivered in a public forum where there can be no discussion, and that there was a reporter or photographers there to record the moment. If the attack had happened when the president was at the White House, I probably would have walked into the Oval Office and told the president, or his national security advisor would have, or his press secretary. And there wouldn't have been any record of the conversation. There wouldn't have been any record of the moment, except in the diary of the president. So I recognize that what happened to me was very rare. It wasn't an invitation I sought. President Bush did not have to answer a challenge like that because he wanted to. He answered the challenge because he needed to. And he promised to. He gave an oath to meet that challenge. You know, that day when he took his oath of office, you remember it was a cold, rainy, almost snowy day in Washington, D.C. And when he raised his right hand and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Rehnquist, administered the oath, I don't think he thought much about the oath. I suspect his mind was more focused on his inaugural address that was going to be delivered right afterwards. And you should read that inaugural address, by the way. It was a very good inaugural address. But I'm convinced when I whispered into his ear in that classroom on a very different day, that he also focused on that oath and the unique obligation that he had. So I was not looking to be part of an iconic moment. It's funny, you know, it's a big deal to be the Chief of Staff to the President. It's a very, very big deal. I knew it was a big deal. And I felt very privileged that I was asked to be the President's Chief of Staff. But I was truly not trying to I was not trying to create iconic moments for me. I wasn't even truly trying to create iconic moments for the President. I wanted the President to have everything he needed to make tough decisions. I paid attention to his life, his complete life, because I never wanted him to be hungry, angry, lonely, or tired when he made a tough decision. And I wanted to make sure he had time to eat, sleep, and be merry as he was doing an impossibly difficult job. I also wanted to make sure that he was never presented monolithic counsel. I wanted to make sure that no one staffer had a larger thumb on that scale than anybody else. Tough challenge for a Chief of Staff, especially when you have type A personalities and they all know they're the smartest. But I'm lucky. I'm so lucky. I worked for the smartest person in the whole world. All you had to do was ask him, and that was John Sununu. And he was really smart. And I loved working with him, and he made me smarter. Yes, any other question?
This side, maybe.
I know that Professor Anderson offered extra credit to any human traditions student who would answer or ask a question. Is there anyone here brave enough?
You know, I'm going to recommend a book to you called Presidential Courage. And by, Michael Beschloff is the author, and I would commend it to your reading because it tells of the courage that presidents have that most of us didn't learn when we actually read history. And presidential courage requires the courage to be lonely.
I think we have a question.
Yes.
Dean Card, what do you think was, my name is Callie Gurley, and I'm a librarian here at UNE. What do you think in your background was the thing that prepared you the most for what you had to do as Chief of Staff?
Well, I was very blessed to have wonderful parents, wonderful grandparents, so I had terrific role models. I was encouraged to be engaged in our community and be a citizen in our community, both politically as well as socially, and was very active in Boy Scouting, was very active in my faith. I can't imagine doing the job of a president or doing the job of a chief of staff without practicing faith, especially the president. The chief of staff's job is hard because you have to decide what the president needs to know, and when you get that wrong, there are consequences. But the truth is the president's job is much more difficult because the president never has the luxury of making an easy decision. We talk about the presidential decisions at the dining room table all the time, and those are the ones that are easily anticipated, and we have firm opinions, and a lot of Americans have opinions, and we disagree. But I've come to realize that I want my president to have the capacity to make decisions that are really tough that I never could have anticipated. And I didn't agree with every decision every president that I worked for made. I certainly didn't agree with every decision that President George W. Bush made. But I respected how he made every single decision, and I respected the reality that they were his decisions to make. And I respect the Constitution that says they are the president's decisions, they aren't a committee's decision. So I would say growing up in a family that said get engaged, but it's also looking at the role models in life. There are no two greater role models than President Bush and Barbara Bush. And so think what a privilege it was for me to be able to get to know them. But probably the greatest contribution to my experiences came because of the founding fathers writing a document that said, it's my government. And whether you like it or not, I can participate. And that invitation is so compelling. It is so compelling. But anyway, I've rambled too
We
much.
have a question this side.
This will be the last question.
This is, yes.
Hello, I'm Ryan. I'm a senior environmental science student. I was just curious, there seemed to be a significant number, or at least a vocal minority, that sort of believed that 9/11 was a hoax. So I'm kind of wondering what your perspective was on that and how you
My
dealt with
perspective on what?
on the minority that seemed to believe, or this at least vocal minority that seemed to believe that 9/11 was a hoax, or that it
Okay.
was otherwise set up by the government. I was wondering how you dealt with such comments under the stress and sort of what you thought about that view.
Your question is phenomenally relevant because during the week of remembrance for 9/11, I delivered a speech in Paris. And I was only in Paris for, I think, 18 hours, 19 hours, but I went over and delivered a speech, and it was to a very significant gathering of business leaders. And an audience that included, Germans and Dutch and French and British and Italian and some Estonians and Slovakians and Slovenians, Romanians. And the comments, my talk was about the ramifications of 2011 on today's economy in the world. But the questions all centered around 9/11 the day. And after the speech and the Q&A afterwards, it was very late in the evening, and 3 business leaders came up to me, and they obviously very competent and highly regarded. And they said, well, we've seen the intelligence that shows that 9/11 was actually planned and executed by the United States government because President Bush wanted to go to war. And I said, I am truly offended by that. I'm offended. President Bush did not want to go to war. I don't know any president that wants to go to war. The government did not plan that attack. And if anyone in the government had planned it, it would have been found out and it wouldn't have been taken. I said, I'm truly offended. The conspiracy theorists are wrong, There are so many studies and there's so much research done. No president, no general, no admiral, no governor, no senator would want to kill innocent Americans as a ruse for another cause. So I really am offended by the conspiracy theorist. And I hold up our government. How many of you in this room are perfectionists? I say that, admit it. I'm like perfectly smart all the time, and I've got great ideas. And I told my son when he graduated from high school, and he was a perfectionist when he graduated from high school, he had an opinion on everything, and he was right. And I said, run for president right now because your bumper sticker could be, vote for me now while I know everything. I said, because starting tomorrow, you're going to realize you know less and less every day, not more and more. I have found that if you are a perfectionist, your voice is desperately needed in the debate over how our government functions. However, if you are a perfectionist who remains a perfectionist rather than finds the courage to work for perfectly good, you will become increasingly irrelevant in the process. I want our government to work. I was blessed to work with 3 presidents who found great courage to make decisions that allowed government to work, even though it wasn't always perfect. And that reflects back on the Constitution. That Constitution that we have does say that we're all part of it. But the perfectionists that were trying to write the Constitution weren't appointed to the Committee on Style that produced it. It was a compromise that created our government, and it's a compromising people that will allow our government to continue to exist. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you so much. It's so moving. Very powerful, powerful. Thank you.
I'd like to make just a couple of remarks in closing. If you just take a seat for a minute. In a conversation that President Rippich and I had with Dean Card before this session, I asked him what it felt like to be an academic, because he's only been a dean a couple of months. And he said it was truly a different world than the White House. But I want to tell you, Dean Card, that you're a really gifted teacher. And the way you presented this story was, as someone in the audience said, quite touching and very powerful. So I thank you for that gift. And one last closing comment. I'm fairly new in the community. I've been here 3.5 months now. And I have had an opportunity, of course, to observe with some fresh eyes. And what I observe here is a really warm community. And I think that this community has great care and great family. And I'd like to thank the president and his wife for being so much a part of this community, because they have been for many, many years. Thank you.